Hello friends, happy afternoon. Today we hopefully stream the whole thing. This time I hopefully have enough failover that even if the stream breaks up, I have a recording. So let's start with some time zone stuff that Matt offered to fill in for Tarek. Matt, do you want to talk about it?
Sure. So we'll start with this one, 49407. This is sort of a follow-on to a PR that Tarek already completed regarding conversion between the Windows time zone identifiers and the IANA time zone identifiers. The work that's been converted or completed already is such that the existing APIs can work with either set of IDs. So if you call find system time zone by ID and you pass the wrong one for your platform, it does that conversion now implicitly. This API proposal is to have an explicit way to do that, because there are various APIs you might be interacting with that you need to pass one form or the other specifically. And I iterate through some of the scenarios further in the thread. I'll go line by line through the API. So the first one is a Boolean has IANA ID. Basically, there are only two types of identifiers we're concerned with, and it's either a Windows ID or an IANA ID. I suppose it could be a custom built time zone, but then has IANA ID would also be false. So we didn't feel like an enum was appropriate for a simple bool. The reason we need it is so that somebody knows ahead of time whether they need to explicitly call one of these convert methods below. Otherwise, they would have to always call them, even in the cases where they didn't need it. So basically, we have two directions of conversions. We have from IANA to Windows and from Windows to IANA. And if you see the Windows to IANA direction has an overload with a region parameter. And that's because while there is a one-way mapping from an IANA ID to a given Windows ID, there is a one-to-n mapping in the other direction. The way the data works under the hood is there's a primary zone. They call it the golden zone in ICU or CLDR parlance. So if you don't specify a region, that's the one you get. An example would be if I pass in Pacific Standard Time as a Windows ID, the golden zone is America/Los Angeles for the IANA ID. However, if I know for a fact that I'm interested in the Canadian variant of that, then I would pass CA for the region. And instead of America/Los Angeles, I would get America/Vancouver. So these are pretty simple. They are almost identical to the ones that I have in my time zone converter library, which should hopefully no longer be needed once these are in place. And that's about it. Questions?
So I assume these conversions can happen on any operating system, right? They're not tied to calling Windows APIs, or do they only work on Windows?
They work when we have the Windows XML files that come with ICU. So in environments where we have the full ICU, then we can do the conversion in either direction. So that would be Windows and Unix, but not things like the browser.
And so that's what the try means, right? Try basically means I couldn't convert it because either there is no mapping or the file was not present, right?
Or the value you passed was invalid.
Right. But there's no way this thing would throw. It will return false or it will work.
Right.
Yeah, the only reason I'm asking is because you have an attribute to mark APIs as Windows specific, but it sounds like they aren't Windows specific. It just is depending on data that is carried by the app or the framework for that matter. Right.
And there are example cases or example scenarios where you might be on Unix and still be working with Windows time zones. One I can think of off the top of my head is if you're working with SQL Server, it has a time zone functionality that is Windows specific, even if it is SQL for Linux.
Makes sense. Any questions or concerns?
So on Alpine, everything will return false. Sorry, on our default Alpine container, which has no ICU, everything will return false because we don't have the data files.
Correct. If libicu is not installed, then it would return false. Has IANA would return true because it's coming from time zone info would be coming from the TZ data. Again, Alpine doesn't have TZ data by default, so that would you wouldn't even have a time zone info without it.
Okay.
And the property you have as IANA ID is only tied to the like when would this return false basically?
It would return false if you constructed the time zone info object from a Windows ID. So if I so regardless of which platform I'm on, if I say time zone info dot find by system ID, I'm going to get a time zone info object back that has that ID. Even if there's some conversion going on under the hood, I'm going to get that back. So I might be on Linux, and under the hood we might map to America Los Angeles, the IANA ID, but we're still going to set the ID property to the one you asked for. So it has IANA ID would be false. In which case, if I need the Windows ID, then I'm going to have to say, well, does it have the IANA ID? No, it doesn't. So I need to try convert IANA to Windows. Directly to answer your question, it would be false either if the ID is a Windows ID or if you did something like create custom time zone, and so the ID is neither.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about like what's the if people write basic code that says, and it's an instance property, right? That's correct. It's not because it's actually tied to the current time zone you're on, right? So the idea is, so if I say if the time zone info does not have an IANA ID, then I have to call one of the static methods, right? And basically I guess what I'm trying to get at is so it doesn't sound like this property would predict whether these methods would return false, right? It's completely independent. It just gives you information about the time zone itself and how it was constructed, or how this, what the syntax is that the ID was that you constructed, I guess.
Right. So the alternative would be to not have this set of instance Boolean and static conversions, and instead you would have instance methods such as try get Windows ID, try get IANA ID, which Tarek and I discussed and felt that was a little bit cumbersome.
Yeah, I think it makes more sense as proposed. There's no reason to go constructing the objects to convert them, especially if you're trying to do a bulk UI type thing. So
yeah, I mean, it also doesn't seem like it's a mainline scenario, right? In which case statics are probably more appropriate.
Yep. In general, the only reason one would need to use any of these three conversion methods is if they knew that what they're going to do with the result was call something else that required it in a particular format. And they might want to put a check in front of it using that Boolean.
Makes sense. Does anybody have any questions or concerns, or can we just approve this as proposed?
Just making sure that we're using IANA correctly here, and that it is really the ID as registered by the Internet Authority on names and whatever the other A is, addresses, and that it's not just an ICU ID or whatever. Is it so? IANA is the correct term in this case. All right, then
it's
ship it.
There's a whole debate about whether it should be the correct term or not, but at least for the last decade, it has been the de facto term.
Right, but somewhere on IANA. I'm pretty sure org. There's the page that has all these things listed, and so it is an IANA displayed list, even if they're not the authority.
Yeah. Yes.
So, okay.
And Windows ID is the right term for the Windows version?
So that's also complicated in that Windows does have some APIs that are using IANA IDs, and it's not set in stone that Windows will always use its legacy IDs. One day it may only use IANA IDs, but these IDs do not exist out of Windows. So calling them like Microsoft IDs isn't quite right. The best term we have is Windows ID.
Okay.
And it's not an LSID, right? It's a different thing, right?
Say that again. Sorry.
It's not an LSID, right? An LCID, like the
right.
1033 or whatever.
It's actually a registry key name that is kind of locked in. So like in the Win32 APIs, they're called time zone key names.
Cool.
Because emo, all of the United States is 1033, but we have 4 different time zones, unless it's still
sorry.
6.
Yeah. See, I don't know what I'm talking about.
Actually, it's more than that, because I apologize to anyone in Alaska or Hawaii and Guam.
Arizona.
I don't even know where you are. That's why I got 6, because I remembered Indiana. Indiana has its own registry entry because daylight saving time is off if you go back to when I lived there and they were sensible.
Yep. There are actually 2 in Alaska, so you got most of it right.
Yeah.
Nullability annotations. There was a question mark at the end of that phrase.
Oh, like the outs probably need the null if false or what? Or
Yeah,
not
Like,
null if.
Do I have to specify a region if I call that overload, for instance? Like, is it optional?
That's a good question. It could just resort back to the one without it. A null could just be implicitly the same as not providing one. But that's up for you guys to decide, I guess.
Then should it be one method?
Is common.
It makes sense. Like maybe I'm calling these APIs in bulk and I don't want to have to put my own if null call one version of the API, otherwise not.
Yeah.
Should it be one method then, or should it be overloads?
Given the out, it feels better to me as the overload, just because it would work as a defaulted parameter if we move the region to after the out, but it just feels. If we think it's at all common, and I do believe people do live in Canada, then it's probably a bit more mainline than defaulted parameters.
Yeah, if they would play nicer, it would be. Yeah. This goes back to like the try pattern really probably should have been a return tuple, but hey. All right, so then I guess this
I'm happy to listen to that argument with Anders.
Well, I mean, there was like, before we had tuples, right? So here we go. All right, next one. That looks easy.
Yeah. This is a single property on the existing timeZoneInfo.adjustment rule class. Adjustment rules represent the different parts of a time zone in the way they change over time. Knowing that we have differences in how DST is applied now or later, and sometimes we have changes in the standard time. The changes in the standard time is what this is really about. Going back to the original design of adjustment rule, it was very closely modeled to the registry data in Windows, except it was presumed that the base UTC offset would never change, and that turns out to be false. So there is already some accountability for this in adjustment rule, but not by a field that is exposed. We have this internal field called base UTC offset delta, which tracks the delta between the version of this property that's sitting on timeZoneInfo and the one that applies to that rule. We don't expose that either. So it makes sense to have a full representation of this data. There are many scenarios where one needs it, but you can't get at it without reflection right now.
So time zone already has a base UTC offset. Does this one override it, or does this one adjust that one?
The one on timeZoneInfo is the current one. It always has been, but if it changes, which it can, it's not the one that was in effect or the one that you might be working with for any particular conversion operation. It is the current one. So really, its best use is for like calculating a display name or sorting them. The one on adjustment rule is fixed. It is the one that applies to that adjustment rule. So one can expect that if you look at the applicability dates of the adjustment rule, that the one that is applicable now will also be the same one on timeZoneInfo.
Yeah, my recollection is Morocco recently changed their base UTC offset, right? But let's assert that they did. So if you ask right now, the timeZoneInfo for Morocco would give +1 or wherever they are. But if you ask for the adjustment rules and you go back and you're looking at a rule that was only active 5 years ago, it'll say that it was +0.
Right. Trek has a good example here with Yakutsk in Russia, and it has that exact situation. Do note that the base UTC offset is not the same as the offset that's in effect. We have a method for that on time zone info already called get UTC offset. It is the base for the rule, and the rule already has a daylight delta property, so you would still have to add them together to get the actual one in effect.
And then, like today, people use time zone info base UTC offset plus the adjustment rule daylight delta, right? They would switch to use adjustment rule based UTC offset plus daylight delta.
Yeah, the problem by using the way they have it today is that they can't take into account the differences in the base offset over time. And so by having this property exposed, they can.
Right. Arizona decides they're done being based off mountain. They decide they want to jump to central. So the Arizona time zone in 2022 changes its base offset to minus, I can do this, 6. Yeah, 5. But if you get an adjustment rule from the past, it'll say -6. And so if you're doing past computations, you'll be wrong, or future if we already have the knowledge that the rule is going to go active next month. So
there's actually a bill in the U.S. Senate right now. It's still in bill status, so don't panic.
Abolish daylight saving time.
That will shift all of our standard offsets by 1 across most of the country. So this could happen in Pacific time. For example, we might all of a sudden be in standard -7 and never have DST. And so we can't, we would look at time zone info base UTC offset and it would say -7. And the adjustment rules for the past from before this change would say -8.
Yep. Yeah, it makes sense to me. I think there's probably room for an analyzer that says basically anybody talking about the current one on time zone info probably has a subtle bug. But I don't know how best to word that, so I'll just let that float around in your head.
And
almost if you're doing math with it, it seems like you're probably wrong.
Yeah, there's room for additional APIs to like avoid having to use adjustment rules at all, but that's a different topic. I guess the last thing I want to say about this is that I did look into it, and even though this is to get us closer to the way we have data in Windows, the same concepts apply just fine in the way that we interpret data coming from the IANA data in Linux. So it is needed for both.
Yeah, it seems fine to me.
So one question that was in chat is like these adjustments are not for adjusting the IANA time zone database, right? This is basically exposing the adjustments that some country made over time that probably is part of the IANA database anyway, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
It's already in the data. It's not settable by the user unless you are creating a custom time zone, which we really want to avoid people doing anyway.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, even my recollection from 15 years ago is in Linux time zone info, which is presumably just the IANA IDs. There was both America, Los Angeles, and a like UTC -8, and this would be one of the distinctions is, and especially if the U.S. and Canada don't agree on the bill that if it passes, that what. Like there would then be a difference in America, Los Angeles, and America, Vancouver, as of whatever that shift date is.
Right. There are some historical differences already, but currently they are aligned. And so presumably they would hope to lead the same change and they'd still be aligned. But either way, you could have, an adjustment rule in the future, just as well as adjustment rules in the past. It's not always historical.
Yeah.
So we have an API to create adjustment rules. Do we need to be able to pass this into that API?
Great question. I would say yes, but I need to look up that API real quick.
It's called create adjustment rule. There's no constructor on this thing.
Yeah, it seems to take.
Takes all the properties today.
Yeah, it probably should take them as well. Or does it take all of them? Yeah, it does take all of them. Yeah.
It does, yes. That is correct. It would
Good
need
catch,
that.
Eric.
Ordering matters, I suppose.
Well, we'd have to
I
make a new.
Yeah, we would do an overload that just basically is, and we should probably just make it at the end. So for just, consistency.
Well, I mean, what's funny is that's the internal one.
What's the internal one?
Well, sorry, the internal one takes the delta. Well, there's the public create adjustment rule, and then there's internal create adjustment rule. The difference is it gives the base UTC offset delta that it needs in order to properly build the object using the current lack of public API. Yeah, I don't know what a good answer is going to be for how you're computing. I guess you'll figure something out. You must already have to figure something out of how you'll get the base UTC offset if somebody calls the current create rule.
It would be, it would have to go to the time zone info that created it.
Which isn't a parameter.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we really don't want the delta to be the input parameter. It should just be the offset. The delta should be only relevant to the offset that's applied. So like normally delta is either daylight delta would be either 0 or 1 hours. There's one time zone in the world that's half an hour. But for this new parameter, it should be the full offset.
Is that Lord Howe Island?
Lord Howe Island has the half hour presently. Yeah. Some have had different ones in the past, but that's the present one.
If it's not obvious to anyone, I used to have to do a lot of work with time zones.
So one question I have is, so the existing constructor takes date start, date end, daylight delta, daylight transition start, and daylight transition end. But what you're saying is we shouldn't accept the delta?
No. You would just add this one new property, base UTC offset. There's an internal constructor that has base UTC offset delta as a property.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yep.
That's because we needed to track. Like, internally, we do the math with time zone info's base UTC offset, plus this delta that comes in internally, plus the daylight delta if daylight savings time's in effect. So but here, we wouldn't have to do that anymore because now the adjustment rule itself will have the delta, the full offset on it. So we'll forget about the time zone info offset and just use the full offset here.
I have to say, looking at what the data that they have right now from the current create adjustment rule makes me suggest this needs more info to make sure that they can handle existing API populating this member without causing more bugs. Because it doesn't look like there's any way that they have a chance of getting this data populated on custom adjustment rules. And I think we would need an answer to what that means before we want to add the new API.
So should it be nullable? Like, should base UTC offset be nullable? Because if somebody called create adjustment rule without it, what are we going to return?
0.
That would work.
I mean, I would think it would just be 0 at that point, right?
Right, but if we do add, the analyzer that I said of if you're doing math with base UTC offset off of the time zone info, then that would lead you to using the thing that may now be simply unset as opposed to actually being 0. So nullable would convey you need to actually go back and use the other one.
Yeah, I think this needs to be nullable.
Okay, so now I'm slightly at a loss of so basically you're saying we should think about what that means for instances that don't have that data.
Right, anything that is currently using create adjustment rule, I don't see a way that they can build what the value should be, and if we can't build the value, then it needs to be nullable.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. The problem really comes down to adjustment rules shouldn't be something that can be created by itself, but it already can.
Right.
Should really only belong to a time zone info, but we're stuck with what we got.
Should have been an instance method off of time zone info, not a static method off of.
The alternative then would be to allow, if we don't want the nullable, the alternative would be to pass the delta, base UTC offset delta, where the default is 0. There's a choice there. I guess I would want to make that decision.
Yeah, and that's why I said maybe bounce it back to get that question answered.
Sounds good.
Because then you'd have to then the math would be all 3. Then you'd have to go to the time zone info plus this delta plus the daylight delta.
Right. Well, and then the work would only be on the part of the creator, which is fine. But
right, they would just subtract from the base. Yeah.
All right. So
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
am I done with this one? And then I think based on Barry's wishes, let's do this one first.
I have to drop. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
Jeremy, I think this is yours.
Yep. Okay. So we've had many requests over the years for things like, why don't we have CRC32 in .NET? I have to define it in every different project that I work on. And that combined with, some other reasons means this is floated up into actionable now. So the basic idea is that the screen went away.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there. Let me reshare and hope it works.
I turned on my camera and the screen went away. All right, so we need something other than system security cryptography hash algorithm, but we need something that kind of works in almost the same way. So the proposal starts with 2 variants each of 2 algorithms, which are the CRC and XX hash algorithms, and looks at, and with 32 and 64-bit versions of both. Not that we're locking ourselves to only 32 and 64-bit versions, just that those are the commonly used ones. And it asks, what would the family of this look like? So I started it off with, here's the things we need, like the low concept, this is the vague shape of things, and then there's the full proposal dealing with all the spanification of stuff and the fact that they're in types. So in order to make sure that we have, there are then 2 main scenarios. One is one-shots of you just want to call a static method, get the answer off of an amount of data, and you're done. And the other is accumulator patterns. We know that things like the compiler does this when doing, has the file content changed. It doesn't want to buffer the whole file. It has little pieces. It wants to throw them in a piece at a time. So for the accumulator patterns, this is based off of the incremental hash type from crypto hashes. So you can build one, you can append to it, you can reset, you can ask, if I was done right now, what would the hash be? Because that's the thing people have asked for. Or you can say, I'm really done, give me the hash value, and go ahead and reset yourself. Which is why we have both a get current hash and a get hash and reset. And then for the individual algorithms, so each class should only represent one size of the algorithm. So it shouldn't have a property to change which algorithm variant it is, because that usually changes an initialization condition. And then they get static methods called hash in the proposal, and then spanified versions thereof. So let's start with that, and then we can talk about it more verbosely. I guess there are some things that we'll need to decide because they're hard to decide. One is how we want to distribute this. We probably have usage. We would probably get usage off of .NET Standard / .NET Framework users, particularly ones who are using SHA-1 for this purpose because it's convenient for them. But we have feelings about ubing things. And then the other one is we need a namespace proposal. I included just above the current screen position 3 different names that were suggested in the thread, which is system buffers hashing, system IO hashing, and system hashing. I liked buffers best, so it's the one that I put as the strawman. And then the base class, we don't expect anyone to ever really take this as a parameter. It's really just here for making sure that, or letting us write one implementation of the things and making other algorithms be easier to, they only have to override 3 abstract things. And so we went with the extraordinarily verbose and specific non-cryptographic hash algorithm as the straw man. All right. Questions, comments, knife fights?
So what happens when something starts as a cryptographic hash algorithm and then later on we determine, oh, that was a bad idea?
So for things like SHA-1 and MD5, we certainly can't renamespace the class and re-architect them. This is for things that were always designed to never be cryptographic.
Yeah, there's a difference between what used to be cryptographic and is now considered unsafe and what was never cryptographic in the first place.
Fair enough.
So MD5 and SHA-1 are still arguably cryptographic hashes.
Yeah, and they can actually still be used in some cases as cryptographic hashes. There's a huge asterisk on that.
Yeah, HTTP is a good example. There's a header that has MD5 for signing purposes.
So Jeremy, I first about the name, I think the name's probably fine, honestly, because hash algorithm just by itself, I think, implies cryptographic, as you had mentioned. So having this prefix on the name, I think, is appropriate. Are you open to suggestions about other naming stuff right now, or did you want to talk about something else?
I mean, we can go through line by line on the low concept version and then line by line on the full proposal.
Sure. So the initial comment that I had, two comments. First, on the low level proposal, length property to me, I think is a little ambiguous because it could mean either the digest length or the length of all the data that I fed to it so far. So I think just calling it hash length or digest length or something along those lines would be less ambiguous. The second thing that I wanted to call out was I wonder if there is a scenario for having just a get hash and destroy as opposed to get current hash or get hash and reset. What I mean by that is if you imagine an algorithm like the SHA family, for instance, whenever you get the hash, they're actually mutating their underlying buffers in order to do that final computation. And mutating the underlying buffers means you have to make a copy of the state if you think that you might need to go back to that state in the future, such as if another call to append comes in. If the only abstract methods that we have here are get current hash and reset, then there's no way for the class to make an optimized just get hash and then you're done version of the method. And if these are so you're saying just expose it as its own method, not using the low-level APIs?
Right. So the current thing has get current hash core as a protected member. So getting the current one, which for most algorithms will require cloning your state, because once you add the final length, you will have corrupted it. So that one is abstract because you have to do it. Get hash and reset can be implemented in terms of that, but it's on the full proposal, that's actually a protected member. Because to allow you to intercept that and then just set a Boolean that says if anybody calls append, then I need to go through my initialization step again. So you can implement it optimally by just storing that they called that they just called reset. Reset doesn't have to actually modify the state until they call get hash again.
Okay, yeah, that just wasn't entirely intuitive to me as to how somebody could do that in an optimized fashion. But if it's possible, then I'll retract my my comment.
Yeah, so you'd need the extra state of the dirty bit that says that the next call to get current hash or get hash and reset or append needs to go back through the initialization phase if you don't want to pay that cost. But we've seen from hash algorithm instances that people really like pooling objects. And so we could make reset be an explicit step. Again, I started with what we had on incremental hash, which is based on the complicated way that hash algorithm, when it's an iCrypto transform, behaved. So this is really just people who know the existing one that it's easier to move to this one. So I may have a bias for inherited complexity.
No, that's fine. I didn't have any other comments right now.
Yeah, I'll also note once you pointed out the length. Length was supposed to be the hash output size in bytes, and in the sample I said CRC32 is about 8 times bigger than it really is. So clearly it should be called hash length in bytes.
Is system buffers hashing going to be discoverable?
Is Stack Overflow discoverable?
Well, I mean, okay, that assumes it's going to just buffers hashing. Personally, I prefer system.io for this.
System.io or System.io hashing?
Well, system.io.hashing.
Okay.
I mean,
Buffers is hiding it even more.
I mean, I would say, like, I think if you introduce a new namespace, they all have discoverability issues because you have to know to type the namespace name, right? So, like, I think in practical terms, people will probably find the type name before they find the namespace name, no matter what we do. And given that you now have cross namespace completion, I think if you can't find it in the usual places, you just do Control JJ and type CRC32, and then whatever completion shows up, that's the one you take. So to me, like, the discoverability argument isn't as important anymore, so long you know the type names. And so we can pretty much take any namespace you want. It's just more like if you look at the outline, does the outline make sense?
System.io, at least, is the last place I would expect to look. Buffers, I think, is a little bit closer. I would think system hashing or even system numerics would be closer places. If I was looking for hashing algorithms, I'd look for hashing or numerics before buffers, and IO would be the last place I would check. So,
I mean, hashing is possible. It just seems weird to promote this as the top level concept. But I mean, I'm certainly not sold on buffers. I mean, it's just we should probably pick an existing second level namespace and then just introduce a third one and then just
I think
pick one.
One of the earliest proposals was system numerics hashing. And I think the only reason I didn't put it in the list here is at this point, system numerics really feels like it's about vector of t. And
we have been expanding. We have been expanding that big integers there, which is frequently used in hashing algorithms as well. We've got bit operations, which has the primitive CRC32 algorithms, or will as soon as they've been implemented, they've been approved already. So it does kind of fit in the scheme of things. It definitely was originally for like vector types, but we have expanded it to include complex, big integer, and other numerically oriented things.
And so is your suggestion system numerics hashing or just system numerics?
Numerics hashing, I think.
Okay.
So I'd object to that simply because of the word numerics. I mean, people don't think in terms of the output often. They think there's a bunch of things where you're going to end up CRC32ing a string or something of that ilk, and having something that acts on strings inside system.numerics feels odd to me.
That's vector of t, for example, which is the basis of most of our string algorithms.
I realize that, but numerics does not scream string to me.
I mean,
it's like I can only use this on an int. Is what?
Yeah,
what
I think Tanner's arguing from an implementation perspective, and Barry's arguing from a usability perspective.
I mean, to me, it's really like the part where numerics makes sense is not so much the implementation. It's basically let's say that we do take a terrible thing which takes in a string instead of bytes, and where you have the concept of your CRC32ing a string, what hash codes do is turn things into numbers. So anything's the domain, the number is the output.
Hash codes take things and turn them into a collection of bytes.
Yeah.
People don't think of a collection of bytes in terms of numbers.
Fair enough.
Sure. Is there ever a world in which we would want like the base abstractions to exist in a hidden namespace, but for the friendly APIs like CRC32 and whatnot to exist in a more common namespace?
We certainly could.
Rust has standard hash, and they've got a hasher trait, which is basically like an interface they use for defining things. C++ is doing system hash for theirs.
Go has import hash CRC32.
Java's is Java util zip.
That one's a good one.
That one's wrong.
Excellent.
No, utils. Let's start that discussion again. People will love it.
Garbage heap number 1. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I mean, I think I'm fine with system IO hashing as well. I mean, if people, I don't know, I'm probably similar to Barry. I very much dismissed hashing as a second level one. But what do people think? Is that it should be elevated as a top level namespace?
I mean, we have compression under system IO, so I could kind of half see this as a sibling to that, but
that's
if
not
If we had system.hashing, then there would be an argument for moving the cryptographic hashes into that namespace, and I don't think anyone wants to do that.
Yeah.
If it was system IO hashing, I would expect all of these to operate primarily on streams and potentially even be streams themselves, like most of the other things under IO are.
Well, wasn't there a proposal to add streaming APIs to stuff like this? Like append, oh yeah, append stream is already on here, yeah.
Yep.
I mean, almost seems like you want also a top level static hash helper that does that.
Oh, I don't know what you mean by that, Emo.
Like, you know, on CRC32 you have a static hash function, right, that takes a byte array. It seems like you also want one that takes a stream and gives you back, like basically consumes the entire stream and gives you back the byte.
Yeah, we certainly can. It's the nice thing about the builder pattern is, or the instance methods is, we get to write one implementation of append stream, which just calls, you know, reads a little bit and then calls the abstract append read-only span. If we do it as the static, then every algorithm has to write it because it's a pattern unless we have static interfaces by the time we ship this. In which case, it still looks like a pattern if we make it net standard.
Yeah, I think it's always going to be a pattern because I don't think you can standardize even with the interface solution. But yeah, I mean, honestly, like as long as it supports streams in some sensible fashion, I'm honestly fine with saying it's part of IO.
So Jeremy, you also had a full proposal kind of hanging off the bottom of the screen. If we were to look at that, might that cement a particular namespace into our heads?
I don't think so, because it's really just going to show that there are 4 proposed classes, and 4 proposed non-abstract classes, 1 abstract class, and then it's going to show how complicated things are because they're all spanified.
For CRC32, is that the Castagnoli or the regular one?
If I knew the difference, I would answer your question.
I'm asking because for the bit operation CRC32, I think we have the default one being what is technically CRC32C, which is the Castagnoli. And so it uses a slightly different prime in its input. And so I was interested in what it's meant to be here, because if it's the non-Castagnoli one, then we might want to update the bit operations one before we implement it, just so that they're consistent across both.
Yeah, I mean, if there are 2, in addition to 2 sizes, if there are 2 variants of CRC that are in common use, then we can expand this to be both CRC32 and CRC32C. And then, but if we're using CRC32C for the bit operations, then I agree we should call it CRC32C.
So we did the C1 with bit operations because that's the one that's common to both Intel and ARM, Intel, AMD, and ARM. ARM, however, also exposes support for the non-C1. And then we didn't expose that in bit operations today, but we left it open to be able to expose in the future. So there's at least 2 that are fairly common, given that they've got hardware support.
Yeah. So yeah, granted it's a different proposal, but based on the tangent here, it sounds like the one in bit operations should have the C suffix if that's the standard name of the algorithm using that variant. And again, I picked CRC32 and 64 because I know Office has used them in their file formats for years, and that I've seen many requests for them. I personally wasn't aware that there was a variant using an extremely similar name.
Yeah, there's actually 32, 32C, 32K, and 32K2. Oh, and 32Q.
Okay. So I think CRC32 should be whatever CRC32 is on the Wikipedia table as of 5 minutes ago. And we can add the others as necessary. Again, this is basically about making a template that we would follow for any time that we want to have another inbox hash algorithm or standard OOB hash algorithm.
So what I'm hearing, then we are okay with system.io hashing as a namespace?
I agree with Tanner. I wouldn't look there. I agree with Emo. I would type the thing in and ask the IDE to solve it, or I would go to Google and say, .NET CRC32, and it would say it's in system.io hashing, and I'd be like, cool, whatever. So
it would say it's in system runtime intrinsics or whatever.
I'd prefer buffers over IO. I think that just makes more sense, at least to me, because these aren't themselves streams, and so I don't think they fit well in IO. There are more things that use streams, which we have in multiple places across .NET. But I don't have a super strong preference.
That matches my feelings.
So we have to pick one, and it seems like now we all have individual proposals. We need some sort of tiebreaker. Like, Barry, what was your thought? I think you were a fan of IO, right?
I was underneath IO, and given it's me that's pushing for this to be implemented, obviously I should get what I want.
Well, you're getting the feature. Maybe you have to concede something.
No, absolutely not.
Oh, sorry. Forgot who I was talking to.
I was about to say, have you met Barry? I mean, I think we all seem to agree that the actual name doesn't matter as much because you can always complete it. But like, I think it just has to, like, you have to look at the name and the name has to make sense. But I think they all kind of have that property. It's just we have to pick one place. I kind of agree with Levi's earlier comment, although we can treat it as a peer-to compression. It's also not completely inconceivable that we could have, a non-cryptographic hash algorithm stream that takes an underlying stream, takes an algorithm, and then as you're sucking data through, like, you're getting the hash as an output, for example, right? So we could add this feature in the future. So it's not entirely inconceivable that we actually have a stream that does something sensible here.
We could. I think that CryptoStream is one of the hardest types in .NET to use, and that I don't know that I've ever seen anyone get it right on the first try. But we could certainly make it.
CryptoStream, Jeremy.
Indeed, we can make something exactly as hard to use in a different namespace.
To be perfectly honest, like, where would the implementation for this live? Probably system.buffers.dll or system.memory.dll.
Well, I mean, that's the question of how are we distributing it. It'll probably be system.io.hashing.dll and net standard 2.0. But
I really don't want an OOB package for this. Because
you don't want an OOB?
Because of the patching pain.
Okay, I'm totally fine with that.
But I think
you're the one that gets to go tell certain advisory boards that the only answer for people is to move to .NET 6.
I'm saying I don't want it, but I think we'll have to end up doing it. I'd also remind you in terms of namespaces, Immo, I was nice publicly to you on Twitter this week.
That is true. Not just on Twitter, you even teamed me, and we're nice on Teams too. Like, I was already surprised, but now it makes sense. You want something from me. Now I all.
I didn't know this was coming up until I got your meeting invite, because normally I ignore emails from you. So.
Oh, I'm used to that too. Yeah.
It was serendipitous.
Yeah. Anyway, like, so the fact of who's asking for this is why I expect OOB is desired. I personally don't have a horse in this race, so.
Yeah, we'll have to OOB it, so it'll probably end up in its own little package.
Yeah, I mean, practically speaking, I mean, Levi has a point that the DLL name probably should be somewhat related to the namespace name, but like, I think that ship has sailed in .NET a long time ago, where basically things are completely arbitrary at this point. So I don't actually care what the namespace is in relationship to the assembly. That can be completely disjoint as far as I'm concerned, because whatever we do is auto-referenced, right?
Well, if this is OOBed, it's not auto-referenced.
No, I mean, like, if it's inbox, right? So, like, I mean, I don't really care about the OOB experience, because the OOB experience is always going to be somebody has to tell you what package to install. Like, you will not be able to find this by just completing,
Right.
if you want to target net standard 2, you have to do some research on that. But like if you're now building a .NET 7 app or a .NET 6 app and you want to use CRC32, what's the experience you want to give people, right? And the idea is you type CRC32 and tell you like, yeah, using this namespace, please, right? So long the namespace makes sense and it's not system.Barry's favorite stuff, like I think it's fine. Yeah. And I feel like system buffers hashing does it, system IO hashing does it. So it's just like whatever we pick, let's just pick one and go with it.
Yeah, David or Stefan, if you're on the call, I can't see all the participants. Do you use XXHash or CRCs in ASP.NET? Would it get pulled into your shared framework automatically?
No, we don't use them anywhere. I can answer that one. Thank you.
All right. I'll take your word on it, Barry. Yeah, so since we don't have any internal usage unless compression actually needs it, I think that it would be, if it's OOB, it's full OOB. I don't think we would end up in the, at least in 6, I don't think we would end up with the, it's both in and out of the box.
That's, well, I suppose we're not, the likelihood of this needing patched is low, he says, staring at Jeremy, because you're not going to write any bugs. So, yeah, I suppose fully
I never write bugs. I just write alternatively implemented feature designs.
I mean,
every now and then they get a CVE.
Like in practical terms, it's less about patching. It's more about, can you evolve this thing, or is the API shape immediately frozen, right? So if we ship it inboxed in, let's say, some existing assembly, and then we expose it as an OOP, it just means the OOP can never evolve. So if we add a new algorithm, like, you're screwed basically. So the thing is, if you want to evolve it, basically, because we're saying we start with your minimal approach, and then, early .NET 7 we decide, oh no, people are asking for XXX hash 32.
That's part of the minimum approach.
Yeah, city hash. There you go. Let's come up with other ones, but
yeah, the actual proposal is the full proposal here, and then we can talk about the optional things at the bottom. But
I see. There's low concept versions just for the reviewers. I see. Yeah, so but like, I mean, you could imagine we had another algorithm. I don't know, like, I just make stuff up now, like the IMO hash 64 or whatever, right? So now, are you okay with saying you can't OOP it anymore? I don't know. Like, that's why it might be preferable if we can put.
I'm certainly okay with saying no, you can't have an IMO hash, but no, in general, no, I take your point. And I think this will probably open the floodgates a little for people wanting more of the slightly weirder hashes.
I mean, I think that, like, as long as we're not doing complicated things like projections, if we do, because we've had I think we figured out how to be successful with a thing that is both inbox and OOB as long as it's not a projection.
Right.
But it's if we put the implementation in wherever vector 64 lives right now, and then we just make a new OOB for the ref target, like, that's when we get into trouble and can't rev things anymore. So I think it would be fine as a full OOB, even if it ends up being hybrid later. Yeah,
I mean, if you take your long proposal, I mean, there seems to be enough code in it to not be a joke, right? It's always sad when we like have an assembly with literally a single interface definition, but
right,
we have done.
Yeah, so the original the basically minimum viable product for the start of this is a total of 4 public classes, 4 instantiable classes. CRC32, CRC64, XXHash32, and XXHash64. If we wanted to start off with the notion that we aren't just 32 and 64-bit hashes, we could also add XXHash128. I just don't know that anybody's actually using it.
Yeah, let's add things when there's customers.
Indeed.
I imagine that when we eventually expose int128 and you want uint128, and I'm sure that it will happen eventually as more modern languages are supporting it now. I imagine users will want things like city hash 128 and stuff. So I think we should leave it open in the for the possibility in the future.
The only reason I said add XXHash128 right now is just so it doesn't look like we believe that everything needs to be 32 or 64. But yeah, that's why the length is a yes, that is why the length is a property, and the output is bytes instead of a concrete numeric type. Also, it gets to avoid the problem of Indianness. But yeah, right now all the ones that are proposed, we could have the base class say that the answer is a ulong, but we're not. We're saying it's bytes because they can be arbitrary for any algorithm that anyone wants to write. And then anybody who wants to say, yeah, but I want to take the CRC32 and add 5, like unsafe as.
Why does append not take a span or read-only span?
It
does.
It's the first one, right? The first.
Held like abstract, void, append, read-only span.
Oh, it's above and not connected to the others because it's abstract. Okay.
So that means if you wanted to implement this, we're forcing you to think in terms of span, which seems fine to me, honestly. Like, this is a brand new API surface. These are going to be implemented by people who are doing specialized bit manipulation. Sure, just span the whole thing.
So, question about length. Let's say I want to hash my 6 GB Windows ISO file. Should this be native length or long length to accommodate that?
Length is the size that the output will be.
Okay. So not the input length.
Right.
Is there a way to determine how many bytes were used in
all of them?
Yeah, to determine how many bytes are part of the hash, the computed hash.
No, that's going to be all of them, doesn't it?
Well, you're asking, is there a way to ask how many bytes have I fed to this thing so far?
Yeah, basically, because today we do not have a way to represent in a single span or array more than 2 billion elements. But in practice, particularly with hashing and things like ISOs, you're likely going to be feeding in more than 2 billion bytes. And so it may be important to be able to know.
I'm not
it looks
a
like
fan
that's
of
something
that.
the user could do themselves, though.
Yeah.
I don't see a reason to increase the size of these objects for that when not everyone's going to use it.
It's not just increasing the size of the object. You're now forcing the implementation's append method to worry about stuff like that, because the append method is directly the thing that's abstract, which means that we can't have a wrapper that does this unless we wanted to have append call append core or something like that.
Well,
but it gets weird at that point.
Don't many hashing algorithms use how many bytes they've processed as part of the finalize step?
Some
do.
In which case, many algorithms will, or at least some will end up having to have that data anyways and process it.
But now you're forcing everyone to worry about it.
Right, but in most cases, that's just going to be count plus equals length.
So why would the application need the algorithm itself to keep track of that? Why not? I think it was Corey who was speaking earlier. Like, why not just have the app keep track of it?
Because many algorithms will need to do it anyways, and it simplifies it if there's any special considerations the algorithm has.
I mean, my question would be, how do you use that number? Like, what do you do with that information if it were there?
You can use it as part of validating that the number of bytes processed was correct, for example.
That's called a hash code. Length is the simplest hash code anyone has ever invented. But the yeah, I mean, it feels a little weird. I mean, again, we could certainly do it. Append becomes a protected append core, and we just would add on the thing. Reset would reset it back to 0, but it's it feels it feels weird to me because you're calling, basically it's a property that shows the side effects of how much appending you did. It just is weird, and the static versions won't do that.
And if this was a true sorry, I don't mean true concern. That's unfair. If this was a common concern, we've never been asked for it in cryptographic hashes. So why would the non-cryptographic hashes be different?
Yeah.
I mean, just to like play devil's advocate here, I kind of agree that it doesn't seem very common, but it's a decision we can make only once, right? Because if we ever wanted the length now, it will be a pain in the ass if we want to add this later because of the way the virtuals are basically structured on this type. So that's a decision we have to now make and be very sure that we get it right.
Indeed.
Not necessarily, because as one of the things that I had asked about earlier is like, why can't we put blah 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 method on the base class? And Jeremy's like, well, just add it on the derived class. I mean, the derived class can always have its own number of bytes that you fed me property if it really wants to, if the derived class is already keeping track of that.
Sure, but like now imagine in the future where you have 12 types already, and now you want to add this concept to all of them, right? Like I mean, yes, we could. It's just more work, right?
Right. So we can do it.
I don't think that's ever going to happen, though. Like it's
that's
like,
fair.
like,
Like, I mean,
not all 12 are going to care about it.
that's what I'm saying. Like, I mean, I don't think it's a common enough scenario that we need to support it. All I'm saying is we should make the decision now and be very sure that is basically the correct one.
I mean, we technically can. We could make ourselves be open to the concept in the future by not having public abstract members, right? At the moment we make append, the current public append be append core and the public reset be reset core, we now have the ability to control. You went through, like we called append core, you didn't throw, we increment the bytes consumed property. And reset got called, you didn't throw, we reset it back to 0. Like we can certainly do that. I made them public and abstract because there was no input validation and no base class state manipulation. But if we want to reserve the right to modify state in the future, we would just template method pattern them ahead of time.
I mean, I think that's probably going to harm the API design, to be honest, because if I subclass one of these things, say that I subclass CRC32 and make, Levi CRC32, and I do this dot, do I call append or append core? And oh no, now they have different behaviors.
Yeah, that's fair. On the other hand, I mean, that's the general template pattern that we have, right? So it's not the first time this happens. And even on this type, you have that already with get, hash, and reset, for example, right?
But now we're intentionally forcing people to think about the differences between these two for a scenario where Barry said we have never, in all 20 years of the framework's existence, ever been asked for this.
Yeah, I mean, so again, I agree with that. But I think the one thing I like about the proposal that Jeremy has is it wouldn't just be for the length, right? It would be for any case where we want to do some sort of pre-processing that we want all the types to be able to do, right? So like, I mean, by just doing the append core and reset core, you basically are opening yourself up to saying, sorry, we do have, not sorry, like we basically have a facility to, for example, count the bytes or do some validation or whatever common code you want to have, right? And so arguably if Stream would have done that, maybe Stream wouldn't be such a disaster to subtype, right?
I don't think we can ever add that in the future, though, because if in this current version we have append be a dumb wrapper around append core, we can never, ever, ever in the future change the behavior of append to do anything else, because that would be a breaking change.
Why would it be a breaking change?
Because it's now if I have an application that is compiled against append or append core, and then I upgrade to a new version of the framework, calling either one of those methods will now change different fields inside the object than the runtime exhibited when I first compiled my application.
Right. So if Levi, or let's say Barry, made a hashing algorithm that took append string, if that one calls an encoding and then calls append versus append core, we would get different results in the future if we were trying to capture the number of bytes that were processed.
What do we expect to add in the future? Hashing seems to be a fairly well understood rote thing at this point. Can we reasonably think of what additional features we would have append accomplish?
Append, or you mean additional overloads, or what?
Well, append versus append core. What would we make? What would we do in append beyond this length? Length in bytes property.
Well, bytes consumed, I think, would be the name that we would go with to match what span methods would have done. But
that's aside.
We would probably say if the input is empty, don't bother calling the core method. Like that's the only other thing I can imagine.
So what I'm hearing is we don't think the scenario is common. We don't think we need it anywhere else, and we believe even if we had the append core and reset core, we might corner ourselves anyway due to breaking changes. So that seems to suggest that we don't do append core and reset core, and we also don't expose the length, or the input length.
Or we do them both at the same time, because then it's already in your face that we make a distinction between the public method and the protected method. And if you're adding on top of the algorithm, you still need to funnel back through the public methods.
Fair enough, but that seems, you're optimizing for maybe a corner case, but yeah.
Right, but it's the template method pattern would still work as long as there was the visible side effect of calling the public method. But I do agree with the notion that while it gives us the ability to do it to anybody who just overrode the minimum number of things, they would work. If they were additive, then the way that they called themselves then becomes room for bugs. Granted, it's their bug instead of our bug, but it's still a bug. Sorry, an alternatively implemented design.
All right, so then, okay. So then let's keep it simple, right? Because that's our usual approach, and let's just say screw it, we don't do that, and we don't have length, and because it seems like most people seem to believe that's.
So yeah, I will say the only time that I can think maybe it would be useful to have captured the length for us is if you have a non-seekable stream and you give it like, do you want to put a pump in the way to understand how much we read out of it before it closed? That would be the only reason that it would make sense to me.
But you could always make your own non-cryptographic hash algorithm derived class that captures that information yourself and then forwards it onto the actual worker.
Yeah, you easily could. Yeah. You override CRC32 because I didn't make it sealed. You override append and you do your own counting.
I mean, that's actually a pretty reasonable approach. It's kind of like streams, right? You just wrap and forward, although we know that wrap and forwarding is hard.
Yep.
I mean, that's
this wouldn't even be wrap and forward. This would just be subclass override a single method done.
Yeah, I guess the saving grace here is that it's pretty straightforward, but like we still don't have a delegating stream, right? But that's because we have multiple ways to read and multiple ways to write. So it's kind of hard to write that code now, but this one has a single way to get data in, so that maybe that's good enough.
Append async, returning a task rather than a value task.
It doesn't return a result.
Yes, but if it does go async, then it's going to allocate state machine task, blah, blah, blah.
Yep. Get over it.
I mean, it's a fair question, right? So like, I mean, value task would be worthwhile if 90% of the time you call it.
If you just await it.
Yeah, and you just await it, you would save, right?
Yeah, I don't think the argument of 90% of the time you call it, it returns synchronously is a thing anymore because we have value task doing so many things. I feel like the consideration for value task is now, how critical is this thing to
usability?
Avoid allocations, I guess.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I mean, at minimum, you allocated the object if you're calling this one. We could talk about it differently in terms of the static, but certainly
That's true. You're calling this thing just once, not multiple times. So I think it's actually probably fine. Actually, why wouldn't this just be a static as well?
Well, partially because that means you have to write it multiple times, right?
Yes, that's after the full proposal. And the actual complication there is because you would then have to implement the drain and work in every derived type.
Right, that makes sense. And I suppose if you really meant to, you could append multiple streams.
Yeah. And that's why my proposal, the default proposal, does not include static methods for streams, because it creates a lot of work that has to be replicated in every class. Granted, we could helperize it to actually instantiate the type and just call the other one, in which case, why did we do that? But to write it correctly is a lot of work.
I think since the common case is probably just going to be calling this thing once, that value task versus task doesn't really matter here.
Yeah.
Yeah, the guidance as of last year when we wrote it down in the book was between the non-generic task and value task is you have to have a very, very good reason to use the value task. And I don't see a very, very good reason.
All right.
And in the synchronous case, it returns task.completed task.
Right. So anything else we need to talk about, or is that all of it?
Jeremy, did you have a thought of what you wanted to call the length property?
What I had already had is the proposed alternative of hash length in bytes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
So
what I've written
change that
down.
to the property and the constructor parameter.
Yep.
Yeah. And so then so there's the three abstract methods: append, a read-only span of bytes, abstract reset, and abstract get current hash core, which again, that is without resetting yourself, give the hash as if we called get hash and reset. And then at the bottom of the class in the full proposal, there's get hash and reset core, which is virtual to do the obvious thing, but I imagine most algorithms can implement that more optimally because then they can avoid cloning their state.
Realistically, how much state are we talking about for these algorithms? Like, are we talking maybe a few longs worth of state?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so copying them or zeroing them is like basically free.
Yeah, like,
okay.
I mean, I can't imagine, I haven't actually looked at how CRC32 is written, but I can't imagine it's bigger than 2 longs. Like, okay. Why would you need 128 bits to describe a 64-bit output? I'm sorry, more than 128 bits? I could understand.
So it's literally like a 128-bit SIMD, right? You've now zeroed out your own state. Okay, so that's like 1/4 of a nanosecond.
Yeah.
Great.
But for allowing of more complex types in the future, I feel that either XX hash or city hash has a 1024 variant of like, they're a little bigger, maybe they care. But again, resetting usually just means you're blitting over a thing with your seed state value. Like, it isn't really hard. And so we could get rid of it. I just left it here as, you know, it's my nod to why are we doing wasted work?
Span.fill.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like it's probably a.copy2b because you have this is what 0, like none of them have 0 as 0 that I've ever seen. I guess length. Yeah, so there's get current hash and reset, spanified versions thereof. And then on the statics, or then on the non-abstract types, I have byte array returning hash, and try hash and int returning hash fill, which is just called hash. And I did not moved it to the optional addendum, and my recommendation is to not do it. Support statics for streams because there's not a good way we can code share them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, at most, what we might want to do if we ever want to support something like something like a static in the future, there is similar to what we did with the crypto APIs, and just have like non-cryptographic hash pass in like an enum that corresponds to the hashing algorithm that you care about, or an enum string or something, and then the stream, and then we just have a giant switch statement inside of it.
We could, but that I can't think of a way that we would be able to implement that more optimally than instantiate the algorithm that you asked for. And
it's not optimal. It's just making it easier to call. That's all.
All right.
Yeah. And then the crypto ones, crypto hash algorithm is disposable. There shouldn't be any secrets being held in these, so I didn't make them disposable. Just let the GC eat it. You don't need to using.
That makes sense, because we also want to pool these things too, and high disposable and pooling don't really get along that well.
And that completes. Did I have the cancellation token on the?
You did.
Async?
Yep.
Okay. Well, I know I do here on the static. It made me think to remember to ask if I put it on the. Yeah, I have a pinned async on the full proposal. So yeah, that's it. That is the proposal. It took us 3 years to come up with.
Awesome. Did we like obsolete or deprecate Git hash code on this?
Oh yeah, Morgan had that as a thing. I forgot to update the proposal. Yeah, Git hash code, browsable, never throwing, and obsolete, which is what we did on system.hashcode.
I was about to say, what did we do on hashcode? Yeah, that seems like a good idea.
And then equals can just be reference equality because I don't care.
Yeah. On Git hash code, we have it actually throwing an exception. I'm sorry, on system.hashcode. I don't know if we would want to do that here, but whatever. It's an option.
Yeah, I think we would treat it the same as system hash code because system hash code is really just a fancy version of XX hash 32.
Oh, yeah.
And so learning from that, yeah, browsable never, throw, obsolete, the whole 9 yards. Everything we did for system.hashcode's Git hash code.
Okay. I don't know if making Git hash code throw will break the runtime, but it'll be fun. Let's find out.
Don't put it in the dictionary.
So should we say use get current hash to retrieve the computed hash code?
Yeah, that's what hashcode.gethashcode does.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I just need to have a message for get hash code, right? For the obsolete, but we're basically saying use get current hash to retrieve the computed hash code, and we make it true for error.
Yeah, we would just take the obsolete message that's already on system.hashcode and maybe wordsmith it and bring it right along.
Yeah, that's kind of what I did, but like it was very specific to hash code. So that's why I said. So my proposal is basically use get current hash to retrieve the computed hash code.
Yeah, or get hash and reset, whichever one we want to steer people towards.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to ask.
Depends on whether they want the destructive one or not. Which is again why I think we left it off of system.hashcode there. Of if we made it work, it would be every time you changed it, it would change, or every time you called append, it would change. So I mean, we can go with the longer message, use get current hash or get hash and reset to get the current hash and or reset. Happy, Barry?
I mean, I'm your security PM. I'm never happy.
Are you content, Barry?
I'm grudgingly content.
All right.
I think we take that.
All right. So we decided on system IO hashing full oob.
So I've not said that we need to oob. I just said in the design something on the lines of like should probably be in a separate assembly because there seems to be a need to have it oob and be able to extend the set of types. So I've worded it a little bit more carefully, but I mean we have not really looked at assembly layering in a while, which we arguably probably should as part of API review. But the problem is that this is such an overly constrained problem space where very often there really isn't any design to be made. It's just there's only one way to do it to make it work. So it's probably not the right venue here to discuss this in great detail. But
fair enough. Other than that, it affects what we would call the NuGet package. So
right.
But okay.
All right, then I comment and. We have 35 minutes to do some other stuff.
Real quick MO.
Right.
Since we discussed it earlier, can you open 2036 and scroll to the very bottom and just give the quick sign off that changing it from bit operations CRC32 to CRC32C is desired?
Hold on. Oh, I need to. It's not in the API review list apparently.
No, it's because we've already reviewed and approved it. It's just not been implemented yet.
What was it? 2030?
2036.
Yes, a small number.
Yeah. Just go to the very, very bottom and just say, this looks good to me.
See, we got through 2 in this time frame.
Yeah, that made us twice as productive.
You did.
So I throw everybody under the bus now. All right, so then done.
On system.io hashing, were you saying it's going to be a 1-for-1 OOB or a down level only OOB?
Yeah, that's kind of, I think, the thing we have to figure out. Like, it sounded like people want to be able to evolve the OOB, which kind of means it should be one of those 1-to-1 OOBs.
1-for-1. Okay. All right. Cool. That means that puts it higher in the stack. So
yeah, there's a I can see this opening the floodgates for people who want more of the weirder. Well, let's face it, most non-cryptographic hashes are weird, but some of the ones where there's no actual real standard for it, it's like here's your reference information in C. Good luck. But yeah, keeping it at least OOB everywhere will give us a time to like stabilize and get more. You know, if we have demand for more hashing, we can get those in quicker.
okay. Does it meet our usage requirements for the rest of the framework? So do we want to use this anywhere that is low enough in the stack that it cannot be OOB? So does anything in CoreLib need to use this?
The current expectation is nothing in .NET runtime or the ASP.NET composed shared runtime will ever call this. Sorry, not ever, but as of 6, there are going to be no calls into this.
Okay.
Well, we have Marvin cloned in a few places throughout the libraries. We could remove those clones if we had this.
I feel like Barry said he didn't want Marvin to be a public type for some reason.
Well, yeah,
Okay, sure.
But
Fair enough.
I mean,
Like-
there are random usages of non-cryptographic hashing throughout the framework. So I wanted to make sure that, like, for instance, if we decided that we needed to, using it internally, we could probably get away with, unless we wanted to put it in CoreLib. But definitely if we started exchanging, then that will get.
Yeah, I don't see it. So I definitely don't see us having it as an exchange type anywhere. If we do have internal usages of like CRC64, we could shared source it with.
Okay.
The
OOB
main,
gets the public and the non-OOB gets the internal.
All right.
the main goal for this is for people to go, oh crud, I can't use SHA-1 anywhere anymore. I must use a non-cryptographic hash algorithm. Oh look, we have non-cryptographic hash algorithms.
Okay.
So yeah, that's it.
Got it. Sorry to be the jerk on the Friday, extending the meeting.
No worries.
And I think bit operations is in CoreLib, so we can always have the OOB package for Net6 use the fast hardware accelerated one.
Yeah, if we think it's worth splitting the package for. If the speed up is enough to justify the package complexities of split TFM.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, like something tells me that based on the usage Barry envisions is that this is not tied to core, right? This is tied to anybody who happens to use SHA-1 today will get flagged, right? And that's pretty much all usages across everything we have.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with that flagging has always been there have been no implementations that are standardized. So this is you know the uses that Jeremy hinted at before. You know, for our internal move away from any use of SHA-1, it's become a lot harder because we have no non-cryptographic hashing algorithms that are implemented.
Yes,
Right.
there is still the asterisk in Barry's statement of things that are required by spec in order to use SHA-1, such as public key token.
Right.
Have the other kind of exemption, but if you're using it just as math,
Yeah.
then,
Yeah, we have strong names for those features. All right, so let's close this one then.
Yay! I get something in 6. I'm excited.
Well, to be clear, we only approved the API. We have not assigned a dev to it yet, so we're expecting you to submit the code.
The dev is Jeremy. Let's be perfectly honest. I've already got a time estimate from him, and I just now need to go poke the right people.
I mean, I am expecting honestly that someone else, and Kevin, don't let it be you. You do way too much other important work for me. That someone else will jump on this long before I get a chance to get to it. But
This could be.
Great.
not
All
you,
right.
Kevin.
Oh wow, are you challenging me to write code again? Because I don't think that's a good idea.
As long as you write tests, I don't care.
Barry's tests are called customers.
Did Jeremy just tacitly admit we never look at tests?
No. As long as he writes tests for his implementation, I don't care who writes the code.
Awesome.
I will sign off on the tests as evidence that the code works.
Which, is great considering that, some of these things do not have standardized, this is what your results are.
That's why they're not in the proposal.
Yeah, I know.
All right. So
hi.
Hi, Levi.
Hi, Levi.
So this is a request from the Orleans team. Basically, they are in the process of moving their stuff off of binary formatter. Hooray. But they have an issue that they're running into where they want to send across the wire not just the data inside of a dictionary, but what comparer was this dictionary using? And it turns out that's not actually a very straightforward question to answer, because we have a concept of built-in comparers in the framework, string comparer.ordinal, string comparer.ordinal ignore case, and so on. But there are other comparers that are not the exact instances returned by those singletons that still have basically equivalent behavior when dictionaries, hash sets, and others are constructed around them. So what this API is proposing is a way for you to take an equality comparer and query, hey, string comparer, is this something that you know about that you can tell me its behavior on? So for instance, if you take string comparer.ordinal or string comparer.ordinal ignore case and pass in is well-known ordinal comparer, it will say, yes, I am a well-known ordinal comparer, and I am or am not ignore case. Similarly, if you pass in equality comparer of string.default is well-known ordinal comparer, will say, yes, I am a well-known ordinal comparer, meaning I am not ignore case. Additionally, there are scenarios where you're using culture-aware comparers. Maybe I've wrapped a comparer around cultureinfo.currentCulture or around cultureinfo.invariantCulture. That's what that second API there allows you to do. It allows you to take an equality comparer and say, hey, is there some combination of magic parameters that I can pass into string comparer.create that will reconstruct this thing? And if so, what are those magic parameters? And that's what it's returning back to you. So yeah, that's the big scenario to propagate behavioral information in addition to just data.
So is compare options the right enum here, or should it be like the string compare options one?
No, compare options is the correct enum, because when you're dealing with culture aware specifically, when you create a culture aware comparer, the two parameters that you have to pass in are the compare info and the compare options. The very specific reason we're not returning string comparison as an enum is because string comparison has things like current culture and current UI culture hanging off of it. Well, the server and the client might disagree on what the current culture is. I have no way of knowing how someone could ever possibly interpret current culture as an enum value, so I never return it.
But like the compare options one is a flags enum, right? So like what flags would you return? None, right?
So
only ordinal ignore case, or?
No, so the compare options flags would say things like ignore punctuation, ignore accents. So I want the N and the Enya to compare as equal, for instance, under linguistic comparison.
So it is possible that you return multiple flags, basically.
Yep.
Makes sense.
So this is basically just comparer.getType equal to a fixed list of things? If so, cast it and ask the questions?
Basically, yeah, because we don't. That list, it's not intuitive as to how large that list actually is. I have the list written after all the usage samples, and I don't want to A, have to make all the people special case what's in that list, and B, make that list public.
Right, but it's also assume that the ordinal ignore case comparer is not a sealed type. It will return false if someone extended it because we can no longer guarantee what behavior it's implementing.
It's actually not even public, but yeah.
Sure.
But yeah, you're right. This would be only for things that the runtime itself absolutely knows the behavior of.
Yeah. So things that are non-public types, we could is, and then anything else has to be, and you can't have been derived into doing something other than we would expect.
Correct. In fact, every single one of these is a non-public type.
That makes it easier.
Yeah. Because the singletons all give you back instances of non-public types, because we rely on JIT devirtualization to make things faster. There is a gigantic warning underneath this that basically says, hey, so you want to serialize behavior, not just data. Please keep the following things in mind. Don't do it unless you know what you're doing.
So in other words, it's one of those disclaimers that nobody reads.
Basically, yeah.
I mean, it makes sense. It's the best you can do. I mean,
yeah. And that very last paragraph is where I provide the, as of now, complete list of every single type that we special case.
So
all internal.
So where is that? Oh, this here? Yeah.
No, it's the very bottom paragraph in the issue.
Oh.
So if looking at this from the purpose of, I'll call it serialization, but let's make it more general to state, save and resume. Do we have the appropriate other direction API? Like, do we have a thing that you can give a compare info and a compare options to, and it will give you our well-known implementation?
Yes, and in fact, if you scroll up just a little bit, email, I show sample code for this. A little bit more. Keep going. There. So this sample code demonstrates calling the is well-known APIs and then reconstructing the comparer based on the results of those APIs.
So how do I store the compare info though?
Compare in, like, how do you transmit it across the wire?
Yeah.
Use the name property.
So compare info that's normally part of culture info, right?
Correct, but compare info is its own separate type where you can query its own name and also use compare info.get compare info of name.
Huh.
So pass the name as a string across the wire and then reconstruct it on the other side. Again, look at the disclaimer. Don't do this unless you trust the data.
And logically the
yeah.
name is the culture, right? Or something like that?
Correct, it's the culture.
Yeah. Okay.
I guess someone can always override it, but I think lots of things in the system break if you override it.
Yeah.
And
right.
change.
But again, if you're only returning true if it's something that we knew about, then
yeah.
I mean, I guess you could get the well-known comparison that took a custom-built compare info, which could then be a serialization injection.
Basically, yeah.
So
it's not a very sexy API, to be perfectly honest, but it does solve a problem of how do you persist the same information without actually using binary formatter, and this is how you would do it. Now, again, I want to hit on this point heavily. The fact that you're not using binary formatter doesn't make this a good idea, but in case you really need to do it, here are the APIs to do it.
Okay, since I've now added the attack in my own head, do we already have an API on compare info to ask, are you getting the system standard version of this compare info versus a custom constructed one? I feel like we do. Like we have am I a system culture type thing? But
when you call culture info.get culture info or compare info.get compare info, it's only going to give you the standard ones anyway, unless you call the specific overload that says like allow user overrides or whatever the overload is. So you will get back stuff that the system knows about.
Okay.
The problem is the system can also just start generating things on the fly based on what it thinks you mean. So for instance, I can actually query Windows right now and look for the en-us-whatever culture, and it will say, yeah, I know what you mean. And it's a distinct culture from en-us. So
sure.
Yeah, trust.
We do things different in Washington.
Yeah. Make sure that you trust the data that's coming back before you call these APIs.
That's fair.
All right. So then, any more concerns?
And I believe the nullable annotations on this are all correct, but who knows? Someone smarter than me is going to have to look at that.
Well, the compiler will tell you too.
Do you need to use both? Because the first one is well-known ordinal. So yes. Okay.
Yeah. So ideally, what I actually want to return to you is three things. The first option is this is ordinal and it's ordinal or ordinal ignore case. The second option is it's culture aware. Here's a compare info. Here's a compare options. And the third return value is I don't know what this is. But because we don't have discriminated unions in the runtime yet and in the compiler, Like I can't use a discriminated union for this.
Yeah, based on the current font size and my distance from the monitor, I thought it was just differing in the out shape, but they have different names. So yeah, it seems like a good starting place, if nothing else.
All right, then what I'm hearing is approved.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
My condolences to this API, but what just happened? Oh, okay, it did show up.
I was going to say we have no blocking issues, but someone just promoted something to blocking.
I think
is Steve Tobe still on the call?
I'm here.
Oh.
Yeah. I think this is the other Steve, right? This is Steve Hodder. Is Steve on the call? I don't think he is, right? We don't have anybody.
Oh, we're not looking at the blocking issue. Okay.
I was just going. Oh, sorry. There's another blocking one that we just got. Oh yeah. Okay, fair enough. You can look at that.
I think this must be David who
Yes.
promoted this.
Yep.
He did.
But this was the discussion we had in chat a few minutes ago.
Okay.
So
I can speak to it. ASP.NET, hates every allocation, no matter how small. But cancellation token source in particular can have a multitude of allocations associated with it. So it can have a timer associated with it. It can have a bunch of cached registration objects from previous registrations that were then unregistered. And so it can end up having a fair amount of state associated with it. And in some situations, you'd like to be able to reuse them and pool them. There's technically nothing stopping you from doing that today, as long as you kind of are careful about how you manage stuff. But in particular for ASP.NET, they're concerned about a situation where they've handed out the token to arbitrary code, and that arbitrary code has registered with it and then just simply hasn't unregistered. And they really only want to reuse the token if at a given moment in time, all of those registrations have been cleared out. Now, there's nothing to prevent someone after that from registering, but from their perspective, they see that as being no different from just someone being handed the token again and registering. So the purpose of this API is basically to say, I would like to reset this cancellation token source for reuse. Reset specifically just means if the token has not yet been canceled, then reset it. So it'll only return true if the CTS wasn't canceled and no one is still registered with it.
Okay.
Otherwise, it'll return false.
Wait, it doesn't clear the registrations. It returns false if there is a registration.
I believe that is the desired behavior. I could be wrong. Can you scroll up? Maybe it clears them. Go up. Let me see.
I thought the intent was to clear them.
Oh, okay. Either way, we can do.
Right. Because if it's going to return false if there are still registrations, then the verb doesn't seem to be reset, which is like I can understand that you don't want to reset from a canceled state because that's ambiguous, but resetting from an unfired state to a unfired and no one's listening kind of makes sense.
It's possible it's clear out the registrations. And now that you say that, I think that's actually what I prototyped.
Okay.
The second paragraph here says explicitly that it should clear out the existing registrations.
Okay. Yeah. Right, because it's representing I, the owner of the cancellation token source, hereby decree that any tokens that I gave you are now invalid.
Right.
Unless cancellation happened somewhere along the way, in which case I understand that I'm in a dead state and I need a new one.
Right. The thing that I care most about with this API is we never allow a cancellation token to go from canceled to not canceled. Right. I care much less about anything else. So that's where the try comes in.
And if it's a timer-based CTS, does that reset the timer or does it kill the timer?
It'll kill the timer basically as if setting it to infinite.
I imagine that if we word this correctly, we can get away with saying, you know what, there might also be some situations where the CTS hasn't yet been canceled, but where we can't reliably figure out how to clear out all the registrations. So we're just going to return false anyway and say, please abandon it.
I would like to leave it a little bit ambiguous.
Sure. I'm just trying to understand what the main line, like, because if we want it to be the answering the question, am I pristine? Like
the answer is
it's
answering the question, may I use this for something else?
Right.
If it returns true, go have at it. If it returns no, please do not try and use it again.
Right. So the only question that I really have, I guess, is using the word reset and it's timer based. If reset puts the timer to infinite, is there a way to change the timer again, or
yeah, you just call you call cancel after on the CTS again to set a new time.
Okay. Because I was gonna say otherwise we should just maybe make the try reset return false for timer based sources. But
hold on, question. Does try reset also reset the timer, or it doesn't?
It would have to.
Okay, good. Perfect.
But in particular, by reset,
it turns off the timer.
It turns off the timer. It's not going to remember that you passed to the CTS constructor a particular time, and then set the timer back to that. It's going to set it to infinite.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Cool. So that what I'm hearing is approved as proposed, right?
I think so, yeah. And as Steve, you and I just kind of bantered a few minutes ago, we just need to be careful about the wording.
I'll come up with some sufficiently vague XML comment.
Yeah.
Excellent.
All the concerns that I can think of have been addressed, so it seems fine.
Nice. All right.
While you're there, Emo, you mind just assigning it to me, since there are a few intricacies I want to make sure are done right. Thanks.
Thank God I didn't click close. that was close in the UI.
It's solvable.
It is solvable.
Could I? I have the last tab on here is a one-line.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping it's easy. Maybe we could do it quickly because it's
also
been here for a while.
Yep.
The goal is to expose a static random that anyone can use at any time, rather than having to construct their own if they want to do something. This shows up all over the place. You want an int32, so you have to say new random, or you want to fill in a byte array, so you have to say new random. And the idea is just to expose a random instance that you can use from anywhere for any purpose, and it'll just work.
Love it.
And it's backed by a thread local.
Each operation is backed by a thread local, because we don't want to get into a situation where someone accesses it on one thread, hands it to another thread, and have that be a problem. So it's giving you back a non-thread local instance where every operation accesses TLS.
Okay.
So in other words, even if you pass them, you get the behavior that is bound to that thread.
You still get correct behavior.
Yeah.
Does the current system.random instances, do they allow resetting the seed?
No.
Okay, so constructor only. All right. I was gonna, because that's the only complexity that I think would come off of this one. We have to make it thread safe because you get it from a static, but other than that, as long as there's no user controllable mutation, then it seems good to me.
Yeah.
Are there potential situations where somebody could be this might encourage people to pass around arbitrary random instances, thinking, oh, like I got it through random.shared, so it must be fine. But someone actually gives them like some new random or something, then they just start partying on it for multiple threads.
I mean, I guess, but that's just handing out arbitrary instances.
Yeah. Pretend that the documentation still adds the automatic threading statement of static members are thread safe and instance members aren't, asterisk. Like if you took a random as a parameter, it's not thread safe, or you can't assume it's thread safe.
I mean, the 99.9% use case here is someone does random.shared.next or next bytes or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Okay.
But,
the context behind that was like, does this also require an analyzer or a fixer? But I really don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
I don't think it does.
Yeah,
good answer.
I do appreciate that.
If the
someone passing it was a concern that was already addressed by the proposed design.
If the 99% case is that someone just calls shared.next, should we just add a random.next?
Well, we'd have to add random.next, random.next in 64, random.next bytes, random.next whatever.
Yep.
This way, it's anything that's on there is available.
And we'd have to make it random.next static, random.next int static,
Right.
because those names
yes,
are
that's
taken
true.
by the instance members. So, yeah.
All right. So then that was easy.
All right. Does
Thank you.
anything left look like it's a 10-minute issue? Or since we finished the other meeting 10 minutes late, do we want to finish this one 10 minutes early?
I think, what is this one here? That's the reflection. Do we have anybody who knows this issue here? Forgot who did it. I think Santi did this, but Santi's not on the call, I believe, right? And then this one, yeah, this one is Stevens as well.
Yeah. So this one is people want to be notified when you have a bounded channel. When there are options that you can specify for the bounded channel about what happens if it's full and you try and write something to it. Those are things like the default behavior is to just block, but there are then other options like I want to drop the oldest item, I want to drop the newest item, I want to drop the one that I'm adding and still consider it successful. And people want to be, and that's a setting that's set for the whole channel, so it can't change per item. And then people want to know if it is dropping something. So the idea here is to provide a delegate that gets called back when something is dropped. Ideally, it would be part of the bounded channel options, but it needs to be generic for the same type parameter that the channel is.
Right.
And that doesn't work well. So the kind of middle ground is to just add another constructor that takes the options and the delegate.
I mean, if this is the only thing you foresee that ever needs to be guarded by the same T, that makes sense. Otherwise, we may want to invest in bounded channel options of T that extends bound channel options, right? But yeah.
We could consider that. I have no strong opinion.
But we can also do it once we have it, right? Like it's...
Yeah, it feels like we've had channels for a couple of releases, and this is the first time we want to see T in an option. So when we get a second one, then we can... This will be a slight wart, but it's definitely not the ugliest wart we have. See previous discussions about cryptographic algorithms. I own all the warts.
Thank you.
I can speak to the configuration binder one.
Sweet. This one here?
Yeah, so this is kind of like JSON property name in a way, except configuration can be bound by any source. So you've got POCOs or any sort of configuration type. It's got properties. The job of the configuration binder is to take a configuration source. It could be a JSON file, could be environment variables, many different things, but it ends up getting read as a bag of name value pairs. And so this attribute would take a property name on a target type, and rather than look in the configuration collection based on the property name, it's a layer of indirection that defines a different name for the key value. So, if you have, property name foo, but you want it stored as bar, then you would set, you'd add this attribute to your property that would rename it from the point of view of the extensions configuration binder. So, yeah, the main thing that was in the discussion that was happening here was around, should we use any existing attribute for this or create a new one? And, we basically looked at every attribute in the framework and said, do any of these make sense to reuse for this purpose? And it's like every single, almost any serialization technology we have has an attribute that does this sort of thing, but they're all pretty closely tied to those systems. So, there's one in component model, there's one in data contracts, there's one in XML serializer, there's one in JSON now. So, this is, it doesn't make sense for us to solve, to create the one attribute to rule them all. But, it feels like the right thing to do here is enable this scenario with a new attribute.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Looking at the namespace, there's nothing in it right now that does that, so I guess it's the first time we have an attribute, that's fine.
Yeah, and so just to confirm, this is, you have, a public property foo, you put this attribute on it that says the name is bar, and then that just controls the reading and writing from a file somewhere.
Yep.
Okay, so it's just a serialization alias.
Yep. Yeah.
And then I guess it's a runtime error if the name makes no sense. Like you don't want an analyzer or anything complicated, just runtime error.
Yeah, if you want to create something that doesn't work, you're free to do that. The value space there's already challenges with the configuration system and its value space for keys, because the what is legitimate there is actually domain dependent. So some configuration keys can come from environment variables, and rules for environment variables apply there. And some configuration keys, depending on you're using a JSON provider, okay, well, it's coming from a JSON property, and a different set of rules apply there. So you kind of have to. There's no.
Okay, so spaces, if it's JSON objects, then spaces work because spaces are allowed between quotes. But if it's XML, then they probably aren't. And if it's okay, so it's entirely determined by the load save mechanism. Okay.
Yeah. To add to that, there's transformations that are applied by the different configuration providers. So spaces replaced with underscores if that's appropriate, and yada yada yada. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Really, it's just a question of should there be a companion validity analyzer, and the answer seems like no.
I would put that as a suggestion for the implementer. Say like if it makes sense to do a companion analyzer, but I think if we did come up with an analyzer, we might want to come back with what that would look like. I suspect the only way to do a safe analyzer here would be to constrain the space, constrain the value space, because I bet you there's already divergence between the providers.
Yeah, because I can't imagine any that are going to be happy with an embedded null or super happy with a unpaired surrogate, but I totally agree that the domain will determine several other kinds of error, so it maybe just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, there's very little. I mean, yeah, I would consider it a separate issue. I mean, there's probably need for something like that today, but
yeah.
Cool.
I added the question, and then you can decide.
All right, since it is 1:58 and I believe we're scheduled to end at 2, I move to adjourn.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't think there's anything left that is fast anyway. So then, all right, everyone, have a great weekend, and then I see you better on Tuesday, I believe. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Happy weekend, folks.